Hello everyone, and welcome to the first lecture on remote sensing and imagery. This is quite possibly my favorite topic in all of GIS, if only because of how excited when I get to talk about it. So I'm really glad to be covering it with you right now. We'll cover what remote sensing is and some fundamental concepts you need to understand in order to use it in your GIS work. To start out, this topic is huge. People can and do get multiple graduate degrees in the topics we're talking about now. In contrast, we're going to spend a couple hours formally on it and then anytime you use in your assignments and capstone projects. It can be highly technical, but you can also get started and understand it pretty quickly, so we'll give it a try. First, what's remote sensing anyway? Well, in a way, you're using a form of it right now. The video you're watching was taken by a camera that didn't interact with me in order to capture data about me. Just like we've talked about with geographic data, that data is a model of me, not sufficient to reconstruct me in all ways, but it serves a purpose. It's around 30 pictures a second, composed of 3 bands of raster pixels that capture red, green, and blue light, along with audio synchronized to it. Going back to the question of what remote sensing is, think of it as collecting data about a site you don't have physical access to for whatever reason. We do this with strategically placed and often moving sensors, whether cameras capturing far more types of light than most of you are familiar with that circle the Earth on satellites, or sensors like radar mounted on the ground, on aircraft, or even on satellites as well. The important feature of these sensors is that they capture data about an object that we can't interact with directly, or in other words, they sense data about an object from a remote location. Remote sensing, like the rest of GIS, has applications across the spectrum. If we just look at satellite imagery, we can predict agricultural yields across regions, assess forest health, and determine available water in lakes and reservoirs. Weather and climate data are classic remote sensing uses. Many of you have seen weather satellites showing clouds moving around. It's also commercially important, from consumer uses of satellite imagery for getting in between places, to companies that use imagery to assess economic activity in regions by looking at highway activity. And finally, as you've probably guessed, it's hugely important for defense and intelligence agencies, providing data about locations they could never get physical access to. Okay, but how does it actually work? Well, that depends on the sensor. We generally separate remote sensing into 2 classes of instruments, active and passive. Passive instruments, such as the camera recording me now and the cameras that capture satellite imagery, record energy emitted by something else, usually from the sun, and reflecting off the Earth. Active instruments like radar, on the other hand, emit their own energy and learn something by how, when, and where it's being reflected back to them. Now, the most basic use for aerial imagery is interpretation of it. That is, having a human being take a look at the image and assess it for a specific purpose, whether looking for changes on the landscape, specific human activity, or weather, like we mentioned before. But increasingly, we're having computers use remotely sensed data in automated fashions, asking them to perform tasks that decrease the cost and increase the scope of data collection and assessment by automatically detecting features of interest in a series of images. For that, we need sensors that detect specific parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we'll often call just light. But it's not the light that you're used to in full color. Our eyes can't see most of the electromagnetic spectrum, but instead are tuned to see the wavelengths which define colors that our sun emits the most of, which is itself a pretty cool feat of biological engineering. These parts we cannot see are still important, and you might be familiar with them already, everything from incredibly short gamma rays and X-rays up through ultraviolet light, infrared light, and then communications waves and on to microwave and into radio waves and beyond. While we can't see them, we can often make sensors that can, and each of these wavelengths interacts with matter in different ways. These different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum are defined by their wavelength or frequency. If we consider a wave of light, the distance between 2 peaks, which completes a full wave, is the wavelength. And as the distance between peaks increases, the frequency, which is how often a wave is transmitted per second, decreases. This will make some sense if you think about it because the wave's actual speed is the speed of light. So if the wave moves at a constant speed and you increase the distance between the waves, fewer waves will go by each second. The wavelength and frequency are fundamentally tied to how the light interacts with objects and what light gets emitted back off an object as a result. And looking at me right now, If I look pink or yellowish on screen, it's because when white light, which is a combination of all visible wavelengths of light, is directed at me, my body absorbs some colors, like green, while reflecting the more red and pink wavelengths back to the camera where they're recorded. By understanding the differences in how specific wavelengths interact with different objects, say a forest and a paved road, we can develop wavelength signatures that allow us to detect these features automatically. While we could do that just with visible light, it's much more reliable with more wavelengths of light, which requires more sophisticated sensors and processing software. This is all still evolving. In fact, we may be at a point of significant advancement right now. Computer vision and neural networks are increasingly used in processing of remotely sensed imagery. Recently, a new proof of concept application called TerraPattern was released that allows you to click on an item on a map, say a parking structure or a pond, and see all the locations where something similar is located. All of this automatically determined by computers. In a few years, we'll consider that the new normal, just as we're accustomed to satellite imagery now, but the world of remote sensing is seeing significant investment in techniques and infrastructure that will advance it incredibly rapidly. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Remember that we use remote sensing to gain information about things from far away, using sensors on ground-based monitoring, satellites, and airplanes. These sensors detect portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we can use the resulting data, often as raster images, in manual interpretation or in automated classification with computers. I think this topic is so fascinating, and we'll continue from here next time. See you then.